Hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back through time with me. Tonight, we're traveling to the ancient world, to meet remarkable women whose names have been whispered through the centuries, but whose stories deserve to be remembered. Close your eyes, and let's begin our journey together. Our first story takes us back over 4,000 years, to ancient Mesopotamia, to a time when writing itself was still new and mysterious. The year was around 2300 BC, and in the great city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq, a woman sat in the temple, composing poetry that would echo through millennia. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, one of history's first great empire builders. Sargon had united the city-states of Mesopotamia under his rule, creating the Akkadian Empire. But empires are not built on military might alone. They need culture, religion, and identity to bind their people together. And so Sargon made a choice that would change everything. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna, in the city of Ur. This wasn't simply a ceremonial role. As high priestess, Enheduanna held immense religious and political power. She oversaw the temple complex, managed its vast wealth, and served as a bridge between the human and divine worlds. But Enheduanna would become something far more than a priestess. She would become the world's first author whose name we know. In the quiet of the temple, surrounded by the scent of incense and the flickering of oil lamps, Enheduanna wrote. She composed hymns in the Sumerian language, 42 temple hymns in total, each one dedicated to the temples scattered across her father's empire. These hymns served a political purpose, unifying the diverse religious practices of conquered cities under a common framework. Through her words, she wove together the gods and goddesses of different peoples, creating a shared spiritual tapestry. But her most powerful work was deeply personal. She wrote a collection of hymns to the goddess Inanna, the fierce deity of love and war. In these poems, Enheduanna's voice rings clear across the centuries. She wrote of exile, of betrayal, of her own removal from the temple by a rebel named Lugalane. In her exaltation of Inanna, she cries out to the goddess for help, describing her humiliation and pleading for restoration. And here is the remarkable thing. Enheduanna spoke in the first person. She used her own name in her poetry. She described her own experiences, her own pain, her own faith. This was not anonymous religious text. This was literature with an author, a voice, a human being behind the words. She is the first writer in all of human history whose name and work have both survived. Her prayers were answered. Enheduanna was eventually restored to her position as high priestess. And her influence extended far beyond her lifetime. Her hymns were copied and studied for over 500 years after her death, used as teaching texts in the scribal schools of Mesopotamia. Young scribes learned to write by copying her words, ensuring that her voice would never be forgotten. Enheduanna lived in an age when written language was a new and precious technology. The cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, was still evolving. To write was to perform a kind of magic, to capture thought and voice in physical form, to speak across time itself. We know what she looked like, or at least how she wished to be remembered. A limestone disc was discovered, dating to her time, showing a temple scene. In the center, A woman pours a libation before an altar, while a nude priest stands nearby and attendants participate in the ritual. An inscription identifies the central figure as Enheduanna, the high priestess. She wears the traditional robes of her office, her hair bound up in the style of a priestess. For 40 years, Enheduanna served in the temple of Nana. 40 years of prayers, of rituals, of poetry composed in the cool shadows of ancient walls. She outlived her father Sargon and served under her nephew Naram-Sin, who succeeded to the throne. Through political upheaval and personal crisis, through exile and restoration, she continued to write. What did Enheduanna think about, as she sat in her temple chamber, stylus in hand, the clay tablet before her? Did she know that she was creating something unprecedented? Did she understand that her name would survive when so many others would vanish into dust? Perhaps she did. In her poetry, she asserts her authority, her right to speak, her divine calling. She knew the power of her words. And so tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember Enheduanna. Remember the first-named author, the priestess poet of ancient who wrote herself into history 4,000 years ago. Her words were born in firelight and preserved in clay, and they have traveled all this way, through empires and centuries, just to reach us here, now, in this quiet moment. Rest well, knowing that voices from the ancient world still speak, if we take the time to listen. Let us journey now to ancient Greece, to the golden age of Athens, around 300 BC. The Parthenon gleams on the Acropolis, philosophers debate in the Agora, and yet for all its glory, Athens holds a dark secret. Women are dying in childbirth at alarming rates, suffering from illnesses that go untreated, because they refuse to see male doctors. It is into this world that a young woman named Agnodice is born. From childhood, Agnodice was different. While other girls of her class learned weaving and household management, she watched the physicians at work with fascination. She saw the suffering of women who would rather die than reveal their bodies to male physicians, bound by the strict codes of modesty that governed Athenian society. And she made a decision that would change everything. Agnodice would become a doctor. There was just one problem. In Athens, it was illegal for women to practice medicine. The law was absolute. Any woman caught practicing the healing arts faced the death penalty. The reasons were complex, rooted in fear and superstition. Some claimed that female midwives were using their knowledge to perform abortions or to assist in poisonings. Others simply believed that medicine was too important, too powerful, to be entrusted to women. But Agnodice was undeterred. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing, and traveled to Alexandria in Egypt, where the greatest medical school in the ancient world welcomed students regardless of their background. There, she studied under Herophilus, a legendary physician who was one of the founders of anatomy. Herophilus was a pioneer who performed public dissections, who mapped the human body with unprecedented precision. 4 years, Agnodice studied. She learned about herbs and surgical techniques, about the mysteries of childbirth and the treatment of women's diseases. She became skilled in her craft, brilliant even. And then, her education complete, she returned to Athens. Still disguised as a man, Agnodice began to practice medicine. At first, she treated any patient who came to her. But soon, she noticed something heartbreaking. Athenian women, believing her to be male, refused her care. They would rather suffer, rather die, than be examined by someone they thought was a man. And so Agnodice made another bold choice. When a woman came to her in distress, refusing treatment, Agnodice revealed her secret. She lifted her tunic and showed the patient that she was, in fact, a woman. The effect was immediate and profound. Word spread among the women of Athens like wildfire. There was a physician who understood them, who could help them without shame or fear. Agnodice's practice flourished. Women flocked to her, entrusting her with their lives, their bouts, their most intimate ailments. But success brought danger. The male physicians of Athens began to notice. Their practices were declining. Fewer and fewer women sought their services. Suspicion turned to jealousy, and jealousy turned to accusation. The male doctors brought charges against Agnodice, but not the charges she expected. They accused her of seducing her female patients. It was a clever trap. If Agnodice remained silent, allowed them to believe she was a man, she would be convicted of corruption and improper conduct. Her reputation would be destroyed. But if she defended herself by revealing her true identity, she would be admitting to practicing medicine as a woman, a crime punishable by death. Agnodice stood before the Areopagus, the ancient court of Athens, and made her choice. She revealed that she was a woman. The court fell silent. The law was clear. The penalty was death. But then something extraordinary happened. The women of Athens rose up. The wives and daughters of the most prominent citizens came to the court, their voices united. They testified that Agnodice had saved their lives, that she had delivered their children safely, that she had cured illnesses other doctors could not even diagnose. They declared that if Agnodice must die for helping them, then the men of Athens were not their husbands and protectors, but their enemies and murderers. Faced with this unprecedented uprising, the Areopagus had no choice. They acquitted Agnodice of all charges. But more than that, they changed the law. From that day forward, freeborn women in Athens were permitted to practice medicine, particularly in the care of other women. Agnodice had not only saved her own life. She had opened a door that had been sealed shut, creating a path for countless women who would follow. We do not know how long Agnodice continued to practice, or when she finally rested from her labors. But her story was remembered, passed down through the centuries by writers and historians who marveled at her courage. The Greek author Hyginus recorded her tale in his fables, ensuring that her name would not be forgotten. Think of her tonight, as you settle into sleep. Think of Agnodice, who cut her hair and crossed the sea for knowledge, who risked everything to heal, who faced death with courage, and who changed the world not with weapons or wealth, but with compassion and skill. She reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply to care for others, to use our gifts even when the world tells us we must not. Rest now, and dream of ancient Athens, of women's voices raised in defiance, of a young doctor who would not be silenced. Our journey continues now to the city of Alexandria, jewel of the ancient world, in the late 4th century AD. The great library still stands, though diminished from its former glory. The lighthouse still guides ships to harbor. And in this city where 3 continents meet, where Greek philosophy mingles with Egyptian mysticism and Roman law, a woman teaches mathematics and philosophy to crowds of eager students. Her name is Hypatia. She was born around 350 AD, the daughter of Theon, himself a distinguished mathematician and astronomer who taught at the Museum of Alexandria. From her earliest years, Hypatia was immersed in learning. Her father taught her mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. But he also trained her body as well as her mind, believing that physical health was essential to intellectual excellence. She learned to row, to swim, to ride horses. Theon raised his daughter not as a dutiful wife-to-be, but as a scholar, an equal, a successor to his own work. And Hypatia exceeded all expectations. She traveled to Athens and Rome to study with the greatest philosophers of her age, then returned to Alexandria to teach. By her 30s, she had become the head of the Platonist school in Alexandria, the most prestigious philosophical position in the city. She lectured on the works of Plato and Aristotle, on mathematics and astronomy, and students came from across the Roman Empire to hear her speak. What made Hypatia extraordinary was not just her brilliance, but the respect she commanded. In an age when women were expected to remain silent and secluded, she walked freely through the streets of Alexandria in the simple cloak of a philosopher. She addressed public assemblies. She advised civic leaders on matters of politics and policy. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus wrote that even the magistrates of the city regularly consulted her, such was her reputation for wisdom. Hypatia never married, dedicating her life entirely to philosophy and teaching. She attracted devoted students from all backgrounds, pagan and Christian alike. One of her most famous pupils was Synesius of Cyrene, who would later become a Christian bishop. His letters to her survive, filled with affection and respect. He calls her mother, sister, teacher, and benefactor, and seeks her advice on everything from philosophy to personal troubles. She wrote commentaries on important mathematical works. She collaborated with her father on his commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the great astronomical text that mapped the movements of the stars and planets. She wrote her own commentary on the Arithmetica of Diophantus, a foundational text in algebra. She also wrote a commentary on the conics of Apollonius, which explored the mathematics of curved shapes. Tragically, none of her original writings survive. We know of them only through the references of others, through the testimonies of her students, through fragments and citations. But even these shadows give us a glimpse of a towering intellect. Hypatia lived in a time of tremendous upheaval. The Roman Empire was fracturing. Christianity was rising to dominance, and with it came increasing intolerance for pagan philosophy and traditional learning. Alexandria, once a beacon of cosmopolitan tolerance, was becoming a battleground between different factions of Christians, between Christians and pagans, between reason and fanaticism. The city's prefect, a man named Orestes, was locked in a bitter political struggle with Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Cyril was consolidating religious and political power, shutting down pagan temples, expelling Jewish communities. Orestes resisted, trying to maintain civil order and the traditional tolerance that had made Alexandria great. Hypatia was caught in the middle. As a respected advisor to Orestes, as a symbol of pagan learning and traditional philosophy, she became a target. Rumors spread that she was using witchcraft and sorcery to control the prefect, that her philosophy was preventing Orestes from reconciling with Cyril. In March of 415 AD, a mob of Christian monks, led by a reader named Peter, attacked Hypatia as she traveled through the streets in her chariot. They dragged her from her vehicle to a church called the Caesareum. There, they stripped her and murdered her with broken pottery shards, scraping the flesh from her bones. They dismembered her body and burned the remains. She was approximately 65 years old. The murder sent shockwaves through the Roman world. Even many Christians were horrified. The historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing just a few decades later, called it a deed that brought the greatest disgrace upon Cyril and the Church of Alexandria. No one was ever punished for the crime. After Hypatia's death, the intellectual light of Alexandria began to fade. Philosophers and scholars left the city, fearing for their safety. The tradition of open philosophical inquiry, of rational debate, of learning for its own sake, grew dimmer. But Hypatia herself was not forgotten. Her students remembered her. Writers and historians recorded her story. Across the centuries, she became a symbol of reason, of intellectual freedom, of a woman who refused to be silenced by the constraints of her time. As you close your eyes tonight, think of Hypatia standing before her students, explaining the movements of the planets, unraveling the mysteries of mathematics. Think of her walking through Alexandria in her philosopher's cloak, her mind full of equations and ideas. Think of her courage, her dedication, her unwavering commitment to truth and learning. She reminds us that knowledge is precious, fragile, and worth defending. That the light of reason must be tended carefully, or it can be extinguished. Sleep now, and let her memory be a gentle light in the darkness. We travel now to southern Italy, to the region the ancient Greeks called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. It is sometime between the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, and in the city of Lucania, a woman sits writing a treatise on philosophy that will influence thinkers for generations to come. Her name is Aesara, though some ancient sources call her Arignote. Aesara belonged to the Pythagorean school of philosophy, that mysterious tradition founded by Pythagoras centuries earlier. The Pythagoreans were unusual in the ancient world. Unlike most philosophical schools, they welcomed women as full members, as teachers and thinkers in their own right. They believed that wisdom was not the domain of men alone, that truth could be discovered by anyone with the intellect and dedication to seek it. In this community of seekers, Aesara rose to prominence. She married a man named Exilus, himself a Pythagorean philosopher. But marriage did not end her intellectual life. Instead, she wrote a treatise on human nature that would become one of the most important works of ancient philosophy written by a woman. The work was titled On Human Nature, though only fragments survive today, preserved in quotations by later philosophers. In it, Aesara explored one of the most fundamental questions humans have ever asked. What is the basis of right and wrong? Where does morality come from? Her answer was revolutionary. Aesara argued that the foundation of ethics and law could be found by examining human nature itself. We do not need gods or kings to tell us what is right, she claimed. We need only look within ourselves, study the natural structure of the human soul, and there we will find the principles of justice and virtue. She divided the human soul into three parts. The first was the mind or intellect, the rational part of ourselves that thinks and reasons. The second was the spirited part, the seat of emotions like courage and anger. The third was desire, the part that seeks pleasure and satisfaction. For Aesara, true morality emerged when these three parts of the soul were in harmony, each performing its proper function. The intellect should rule, guided by wisdom. The spirited part should support the intellect with courage and determination. And desire should be moderated, controlled by reason rather than controlling us. This idea of the tripartite soul, of human nature divided into reason, spirit, and appetite, would echo through the centuries. Plato would develop similar ideas in his Republic. Later philosophers would return to this framework again and again. But Aesara was among the first to articulate it clearly, to build an entire ethical system upon it. She wrote that by understanding our own nature, by studying the structure of the human soul, we could discover natural law. Not law imposed from outside, not rules handed down by authorities, but principles inherent in the very fabric of what it means to be human. Justice was not arbitrary. It was natural, discoverable through reason and self-examination. The later philosopher Iamblichus preserved one of her most striking passages. Aesara wrote that the task of philosophy was to investigate both the universal principles that govern all things and the specific nature of human beings. Only by understanding both the cosmos and ourselves could we live rightly. She emphasized that this knowledge was available to all people, men and women alike. The truth did not belong to one gender or one class. It belonged to anyone willing to pursue it with sincerity and rigor. Aesara was part of a remarkable tradition of Pythagorean women philosophers. Ancient sources record the names of dozens of women who studied and taught in the Pythagorean schools: Therano, Damo, Melissa, Maya. They wrote on mathematics, music, ethics, and cosmology. Many of their works have been lost, but their names were remembered, testimony to a brief moment in history when women could participate fully in philosophical discourse. The Pythagorean communities were eventually suppressed. Political enemies attacked their meeting houses. Their members were scattered. The tradition went underground, preserved in fragments and whispers. And with its decline, the prominent role of women in philosophy declined as well. It would be centuries before women would again have such access to philosophical education and recognition. But Aesara's ideas survived. They were copied, quoted, studied. Her vision of natural law, of morality grounded in human nature itself, became part of the foundation of Western ethical thought. Thinkers in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and beyond would return to these concepts, often not knowing that a woman philosopher in ancient Italy had been among the first to articulate them so clearly. There is something deeply moving about this. A woman whose very existence is attested by only a handful of ancient references, whose work survives only in fragments, nevertheless shaped the course of human thought. Her ideas traveled across time and space, influencing minds that never knew her name. Tonight, as sleep draws near, think of Aesara in ancient Lucania, writing by lamplight. Think of her conviction that truth could be found through reason, that justice was not arbitrary but natural, that philosophy belonged to all humanity. Think of all the women whose names we have lost, whose works have vanished, but whose ideas still live in ways we cannot trace. She reminds us that influence is mysterious, that a single voice speaking truth can echo far beyond its own time, even when the speaker is forgotten. Rest now, and know that the questions she asked are still with us. What does it mean to be human? How should we live? What is justice? The answers are still being written. Our journey takes us now to the azure waters of the Aegean Sea, to the year 480 BC. The Persian Empire, the mightiest power the world has ever seen, is locked in a desperate struggle with the small city-states of Greece. And commanding a squadron of warships in the Persian fleet is a woman who will become one of the most skilled naval commanders of the ancient world. Her name is Artemisia. She was the queen of Halicarnassus, a Greek city on the coast of what is now Turkey. Halicarnassus was part of the Persian Empire, and when Artemisia's husband died, she became ruler in her own right. Her son was still a child, too young to lead, and so she assumed full power over the city and its territories, which included the nearby islands of Kos, Nisseros, and Kalymnos. When the Persian king Xerxes gathered his massive invasion force to conquer Greece, Artemisia joined him. But she did not send a representative or a general to lead her ships. She came herself, taking personal command of her naval squadron. She contributed 5 warships to the Persian fleet, and ancient sources tell us these were among the most highly regarded vessels in the entire armada, second only to the ships from the city of Sidon. What makes Artemisia's story remarkable is not just that she fought, but how she fought, and how she was regarded by those around her. The Greek historian Herodotus, our main source for these events, expresses a kind of amazed admiration for her. He writes that among all the commanders in Xerxes' fleet, she alone gave the king sound military advice. Before the great naval battle at Salamis, Xerxes consulted his commanders. One by one, they urged him to fight, confident that their vast fleet would crush the Greeks. But Artemisia counseled caution. She warned the king that the Greeks were superior sailors, that fighting in the narrow straits near Salamis would negate the Persian advantage in numbers. She advised Xerxes to avoid a naval battle and instead march his army overland, letting the Greek alliance collapse on its own through lack of supplies and internal divisions. It was brilliant strategic thinking. But Xerxes, surrounded by commanders eager for glory and convinced of their own superiority, ignored her advice. He ordered the fleet to engage the Greeks at Salamis. The battle was a catastrophe for Persia, exactly as Artemisia had predicted. In the narrow waters, the massive Persian fleet became confused and disorganized. The Greek triremes, smaller and more maneuverable, darted in and out, ramming Persian vessels and wreaking havoc. The Persian fleet was decimated. But in the midst of this disaster, Artemisia distinguished herself through quick thinking and ruthless pragmatism. Herodotus tells a remarkable story. As the battle raged, Artemisia's ship was being pursued by an Athenian trireme. She was trapped, with enemy ships ahead and the Athenian vessel closing from behind. In that desperate moment, she made a shocking decision. She rammed and sank a Persian ship that was blocking her escape. It was a vessel from the city of Kalinda, commanded by King Democythemus. Whether this was intentional treachery or a desperate accident, Herodotus admits he cannot say. But the result was clear. The Athenian captain, seeing Artemisia attack what appeared to be a friendly vessel, assumed her ship must actually be Greek or a deserter from the Persian side. He broke off pursuit and turned to engage other targets. Artemisia escaped, and because the Calindian ship sank with all hands, there were no survivors to report what had happened. King Xerxes, watching the battle from a throne set up on a hill overlooking the strait, saw Artemisia's ship ram and sink an enemy vessel. Or so he thought. He supposedly declared, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." After the disaster at Salamis, Xerxes once again sought Artemisia's counsel. She advised him to return to Persia himself while leaving his general Mardonius to continue the land campaign. Once more, her advice was sound. Xerxes followed it, and Artemisia personally escorted some of the king's sons to safety in Ephesus, commanding the ships that carried them. Herodotus, despite being Greek and writing about an enemy commander, treats Artemisia with remarkable respect. He notes her courage, her intelligence, and her skill. He finds it almost incredible that a woman should be so capable in war, but he cannot deny the evidence. She was, in his account, the best strategic mind in Xerxes' entire command structure. What happened to Artemisia after the Persian Wars is unclear. Some later sources, of questionable reliability, claim she fell in love with a man who rejected her and that she threw herself from a cliff in despair. But this reads more like the kind of moralistic tale later writers like to impose on powerful women, ensuring that they came to appropriately feminine and tragic ends. What we know for certain is that she ruled Halicarnassus, commanded warships in one of history's most important naval battles, and earned the respect of both her enemies and her allies through her skill and courage. Tonight, as you settle into rest, think of Artemisia on the deck of her ship, the wind filling the sails, the sea spray on her face. Think of her standing before kings and admirals, speaking truths they did not want to hear but could not deny. Think of her navigating not just the treacherous waters of the Aegean, but the even more dangerous currents of power, politics, and war. She reminds us that wisdom is often found where we least expect it, and that courage means not just fighting, but knowing when to fight and when to hold back. Let the gentle rocking of imagined waves carry you now into peaceful sleep. Let us travel now to ancient Thessaly, to the mountainous region of northern Greece, sometime in the 2nd or 1st century BC. The night sky stretches above, vast and glittering with stars. And there, watching the heavens with careful, knowing eyes, is a woman who has learned to read the celestial patterns as others read written words. Her name is Agnodice, and the people whisper that she can make the moon disappear from the sky. Thessaly was a land famous in the ancient world for its witches and sorceresses. The Greeks believed that Thessalian women possessed dark powers, that they could brew potions and cast spells, that they practiced magic passed down through generations. But Agnodice's power was of a different kind entirely. Her magic was mathematics. Her sorcery was science. Agnodice belonged to a family of astronomers. Her father's name, according to some sources, was Hegeta, though other ancient writers call him by different names. What matters is that she was trained in the careful observation of the heavens, in the painstaking work of tracking the movements of celestial bodies across the dome of the night sky. She studied the moon with particular dedication. Night after night, year after year, she watched its phases, its path across the stars, its subtle variations in position and brightness. And gradually, through observation and calculation, she learned something extraordinary. She learned to predict when the moon would be eclipsed. In the ancient world, a lunar eclipse was a terrifying event. The moon, that steady companion of the night, would suddenly begin to dim. A shadow would creep across its face, turning it the color of blood. Sometimes it would vanish entirely, leaving the night darker than anyone living had ever seen it. People believed it was an omen, a sign of divine anger, a portent of disaster. But Agnodice understood the truth. She knew that a lunar eclipse occurred when the oath passed between the sun and the moon, casting its shadow across the lunar surface. She knew that these events followed predictable patterns, that they could be calculated in advance by someone who understood the geometry of the heavens. And so she began to make predictions. She would announce to the people of Thessaly that on a certain night, at a certain hour, the moon would disappear from the sky. And when that night came, when the shadow began to creep across the moon's face exactly as she had foretold, the people were amazed and frightened. How could she know? What power did she possess? Some thought she must be the greatest witch who had ever lived, that she had learned spells so powerful she could command even the celestial bodies. They said she could draw down the moon, that she could pull it from the sky with her incantations. The phrase became proverbial in Greek literature. When writers wanted to describe something impossible, something that defied the natural order, they would reference the women of Thessaly who could bring down the moon. But there were others who understood, at least dimly, what Agnodice was really doing. The Greek writer Plutarch, writing several centuries after her time, mentions her specifically. He explains that she was not using magic at all, but rather astronomical knowledge. He writes that she understood the periods of the full moon when it is subject to eclipse and used this knowledge to deceive people into thinking she had supernatural powers. Whether Agnodice actively encouraged people to believe she was a sorceress, or whether she simply allowed them to draw their own conclusions, we cannot say. Perhaps she found it useful to be feared and respected. Perhaps she enjoyed the irony of being called a witch when she was actually a scientist. Or perhaps she simply continued her observations, indifferent to what others thought, driven by the pure desire to understand the cosmos. She was not alone in her work. Ancient sources mention a group of women astronomers from Thessaly, sometimes called the daughters of Aglaonus or the followers of Aglaonus. They formed what might be called a school of astronomy, passing their knowledge from one generation to the next. These women learned to track not just lunar eclipses but also the movements of planets, the rising and setting of important stars, the cycles of the heavens. The knowledge they possessed was hard-won. Without telescopes, without modern instruments, they relied on naked-eye observation and careful record-keeping. They had to note the position of the moon against the background stars, night after night. They had to track its subtle changes in speed and position. They had to recognize patterns that repeated over months and years and decades. To predict a lunar eclipse, Agnodice would have needed to understand the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days after which eclipses repeat in a similar pattern. This knowledge was ancient even in her time, passed down from Babylonian astronomers who had been studying the heavens for thousands of years. Somehow, this knowledge had made its way to Thessaly, and women like Agnodice had learned to use it. The Greek playwright Aristophanes referenced the women who could bring down the moon in his comedies. The Roman poet Horace mentioned them. The idea became so deeply embedded in Greco-Roman culture that for centuries afterward, when people spoke of Thessalian witches, they spoke of their power over the moon. But underneath the myth was the reality. Women studying astronomy, making calculations, understanding celestial mechanics at a time when such knowledge was rare and precious. We do not know when Agnodice died, or what became of her school of astronomy. Like so much knowledge held by women in the ancient world, it eventually faded. The tradition was lost, or perhaps absorbed into other schools of thought, until only the stories remained. Stories of witches who could command the heavens, when the truth was both simpler and more remarkable. They were scientists who could predict them. Tonight, as you close your eyes, look up at the moon in your mind's eye. Imagine Agnodice standing beneath that same moon 2,000 years ago, her calculations complete, certain of what would happen in the hours to come. Imagine her watching as the shadow begins its slow march across the lunar surface, exactly as she predicted, while around her people gasp in fear and wonder. She reminds us that knowledge is power, that understanding the world is itself a kind of magic, and that the line between science and sorcery is sometimes just a matter of who is allowed to explain. Rest now under the watchful moon, and dream of women who read the heavens like a book.